ever wonder who King Arthur was before Mort d'Arthur, before Geoffrey of Monmouth's so-called History of the Kings of Britain? Maybe you've heard that an ancient poem called the Gododin contains the first ever written reference to Arthur. I'll tell you a bit more about that later, but in the meantime, let me tell you about a few books that you could look at if you're interested in Arthur in the early Welsh literature. It's clear that Arthur existed in the minds of the Welsh poets and storytellers long before Geoffrey's Norman era bestseller, The History of the Kings of Britain. We're not going hunting for the historical Arthur in this video. This is just to steer you towards some of the sources that will help you understand the Welsh evidence. There are a couple of books which offer a good overview of the material. So The Arthur of the Welsh, edited by Bromwich, Jarman and Roberts, is a classic from 1991. It can be a bit expensive, but it's on archive.org if you don't mind reading it online. It's a big book with different chapters written by different experts in their field, and you're sure to find lots to interest you. A bit older, but of a similar type, is The Romance of Arthur, edited by Wilhelm and Gross, or Wilhelm, not sure. That's from 1984. And this one starts with the very early material, but it takes you forward to later English and continental literature as well. The chapters on early Welsh literature in that one are very good and a bit less technical than Arthur of the Welsh. This one has had a few covers over the years, so they don't all look like my copy. Because it's been reprinted more, you should find second-hand copies that don't cost too much. While the Gododin does make what appears to be one reference to Arthur, there are other early Welsh sources which give us more than that, especially early Welsh poetry. A great book for exploring this is Arthur in Early Welsh Poetry, edited by Nerys and Jones. And it presents fresh translations of all the relevant poems, and it includes some background information about them. Some of the information in the book gets into the technicalities of medieval Welsh language and poetic meters, but there's also plenty about how Arthur is viewed in Wales at the time. This is quite a recent book, 2019, and it isn't wildly expensive to buy new. If Arthur is central to the poem she's looking at, Jones looks at all of it, but if Arthur's just mentioned briefly in a poem, she might only include that passage. The book includes all the poems relevant to Arthur from the Black Book of Carmarthen, the Book of Taliesin, and so on. As always, I would warn you to avoid the book called The Four Ancient Books of Wales. The translations are bad enough to be very misleading, so please be smart and avoid them. All the covers on your screen are just reprints of the same thing. Don't waste your money. Arthur also features in many of the triads of Britain. Now, once again, you need to be careful to distinguish between the genuine early triads and the ones forged by Iolo Morgannwg in the Mirvrian archaeology. Your best bet is to get a copy of Trioedd Ynys Prydain by Rachel Bromwich. This is currently in print and, considering its size, not really that expensive. And you can trust Bromwich to give you the lowdown on the history of each triad. Now, the triads are getting into the period where some of them are influenced by the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth and hence somewhat fictional. But again, Rachel Bromwich does a pretty good job of discussing the possible age of the different triads. There are also some other short Arthur-related texts in the book, like 13 Treasures of Britain. Trioedd Ynys Prydain also has a big section called Notes to Personal Names, which is interesting entries about other characters from Arthur's court and so on who appear in the triads. Mabinogion also has a lot to offer. Arthur does not feature in the four branches of the Mabinogi, which is kind of the central text, but he's a major player in the lengthy story called Culhwch and Olwen. And parts of this story are clearly very old, and it shows little or no influence from the later Arthurian romances. Combined with the poetry we've been discussing, you'll begin to get a sense of the early Welsh Arthur in this story. The Dream of Rhonabwy, also in the Mabinogion, is another story about Arthur. Now, this story is a satire, but what exactly it's satirizing is a bit of a question. Partly, it's aimed at the political landscape of 12th century Wales, which is many centuries after Arthur, but it may also be satirizing Arthur himself or the way the storytellers of the day presented him. So you'll have to make up your own mind what it's all about. Of course, the Mabinogion also contains the so-called three romances, Owain, Geraint, and Peredur. Each of these stories actually has a slightly different history, but basically each features a knight of Arthur who wanders around having a series of adventures. Each story has one or more counterparts in continental Arthurian literature. It seems that there were early versions of these stories in Wales, which probably influenced the continental versions and influenced the works of Geoffrey, perhaps via Brittany and the Norman storytellers. Those versions then influenced these three new Welsh romances, which combine elements of old native stories with the newer versions. So while these stories aren't as old as some of that poetry we've started with, there's old material incorporated within them. Figuring out which bits of the stories are genuinely old or genuinely Welsh is a challenge for scholars. However, the book I mentioned earlier, The Arthur of the Welsh, it has individual chapters devoted to each of these stories, as well as to Kilhuch and Olwen and a chapter on the dream of Rhonabwy. So if you read that, you won't just be guessing. For a good translation of the Mabinogion in an inexpensive package, I recommend Shauna Davies' translation. If you'd like to delve a little deeper into the topics in my videos, you might enjoy taking one of my online classes. There's almost always something on offer. Some classes have tiered pay what you can pricing, and there are usually a few scholarships available for the more expensive classes. To get notifications about classes and about scholarships when they're announced, you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter or follow me on my Patreon page. So what about that earliest mention of Arthur then? So the Gododin is a poem attributed to a poet called Aneurin. Although it's a long poem, it isn't a saga. It tells us that a group of warriors from near Edinburgh went off to a battle at Catraeth, modern-day Catterick in Yorkshire, where almost all of them died. But it doesn't tell the story of the battle as a narrative. It's mostly a series of elegies for individual dead warriors. It's beautiful poetry that was clearly updated over time, yet its early language shines through, even in translations. Part of it may date to the 7th century when the battle took place. The Gododin has been translated many times by top-notch scholars. These books never seem to stay in print. The translations by Kenneth Jackson, John Koch, Joseph P. Clancy, and A.O.H. Charman are all worth reading if you can find them. I think the only translation in print is this recent one by Gillian Clark. And it's an adequate translation, if not quite so scholarly. If you like early heroic poetry, you'll love it, but don't expect to learn much about Arthur. The reference is in a short elegy for a noble warrior called Gwawerther. Charging ahead of the 300, he cut down the center and the wing. Blazing ahead of the finest army, he gave horses from his winter herd. He fed ravens on the fortress wall, though he was no Arthur, among the strongest in the war, Gwawerther, citadel. Stories from the biographies of saints might not be the first place you'd think to look for Arthur, but he's mentioned in quite a few of them. Stories of St. Cadog, Caranog, Efflam, Gildas, Pattern, and the Breton saint Goegnu all have things to say about Arthur. These things may not be true, but many of them probably reflect Welsh folklore and old legends. Below this video, you'll find a link to a list of the books I've mentioned. All of these saint stories are available online, so I'll include links to them in the PDF. It's a download, but you don't need to leave your email address or anything to get it. You can just help yourself. I hope you found this useful. Let me know in the comments about any books I've forgotten to include.